Good afternoon, folks. I think this is going to be a great follow-up to Helen's presentation. Although I'm not going to speak specifically about control today, control is a very important part of the invasive species battle that we are currently fighting, and I'd love to talk to anybody about control afterwards if they're interested. But today I'm going to talk about the status of exotic invasives on Long Island and what we have to look out for. So just going to go through what is an invasive species, the status, species that are approaching, emerging, or low abundance in the region, and then how do we prepare for these invasions? So things to think about when we're managing land. So what is an invasive species? Why is it important that we have a definition for this? I recall a conversation I had with a landscape architect many years ago, and we were talking about replacement for a vine he had spec'd out on a plan. And we had suggested the use of Virginia creeper, which is a great native vine. And he turned around and said to us, well, Virginia creeper, that's invasive. And in his mind, it was invasive because it didn't do what he wanted it to do. It would take over his landscape plan in a way that he didn't want it to. So I think it's important that we have a very valid and scientific definition of what is invasive so we don't confuse invasive species from weedy species, which is still often done in literature. So again, a scientific approach. As a scientist, it's, in our opinion, the best approach. So in 2008, the Nature Conservancy and the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, they developed a protocol for assessing and ranking invasive species. The Long Island Invasive Species Management Area, which I am a part of, and there are many of us out there that are a part of, designate a scientific review committee to provide input on species and conduct individual assessments, and I'll go through that in a little bit. So as of March of 2013, there are 183 species assessed. That being said, there are many cultivars that have not yet been assessed. So the ranking system that they went through included scoring in 4 different categories. So the ecological impact of the species. What does it do to the ecosystem? How does it change it? What kind of organisms does it affect? The biological characteristics and dispersal ability of the species. So is it only dispersed by humans planting it? Can birds carry it? Can the wind carry it? Is it rhizomatic? Will soil movement affect how it's spread? These are all important things that were thought about and ranked for each species. The ecological amplitude and distribution of the species. So are there large stands of this, like Phragmites? Or are there isolated occurrences? And of course, the difficulty of control of the species. So things like garlic mustard can be self-limiting over time, but oriental bittersweet can take over very quickly and become very difficult to fight because it is such a large woody vine. So these scores were totaled, and a relative maximum score was given. So let's say, for whatever reason, the review committee could not assign a score to a particular category, those points were taken out. So that way, each plant was normalized for what it could be assessed for. And you can actually look up this assessment and the data. Dr. Marilyn Jordan and Troy Weldy had published this, well, sorry, it's an unpublished report, but it is available on the LISMA website. So what do these scores tell us? Species ranked very high or high are generally highly invasive, and they're included on the state and county lists which prohibit sale. Things like, again, garlic mustard, oriental bittersweet, which are popular for either medicinal or ornamental purposes, but are very damaging to the ecosystem and the environment, are on those lists and were ranked very high. But there are other species that can be incredibly invasive if we plant them. Those are things that are ranked moderate. So things like English ivy. There's no real aerial dispersal method of English ivy. People have to plant it. However, if you plant it, and those of us that have it in our backyards know, it can destroy trees and pull them down. And it really is very difficult to get rid of. And one that's been very popular lately, bamboo. This is a bamboo forest. You basically lose the entire ecosystem that was in its place in favor of this incredibly invasive grass. So while this impact may be as great as something that is ranked high and very high, it's ranked moderate because we physically have to put it in the ground. So we're going to talk about the status of invasive plants on Long Island for a little bit. What do we have that's abundant? What do we have that's not so abundant? So I'm just going to go through a couple of examples. The widespread species you're going to see on almost any disturbed site on Long Island. You could walk on and you're almost guaranteed to find it. So Oriental bittersweet, most of us are familiar with. It's a large woody vine that makes very pretty red berries that birds like to eat and disperse. Multiflora rose, which is, Multiflora rose, which is my painful friend. You will see it in a lot of forest edges, is incredibly thorny, and becomes very abundant very quickly. Garlic mustard, again, although self-limiting over time, loves to colonize recently disturbed surfaces. And Norway maple can replace forests and become very disturbed over time. So this is a picture of a pure Norway maple forest. Notice that there's no understory. So there's kind of a part of our ecosystem that's missing right here. Things that are more isolated are kudzu. So although we don't see kudzu like this on Long Island, we do have some occurrences of it. Perennial pepperweed is isolated to West Meadow Beach and Flax Pond. And giant hogweed, believe it or not, also does have a couple of occurrences on Long Island. This is incredibly noxious, so if you think you encounter it or any of its relatives, such as parsnip, stay away. It can actually burn and scald the skin and cause severe damage. So just to compare widespread occurrences versus isolated occurrences, we can look at the distribution of Oriental bittersweet. This is from IMAP Invasives, which is a tool I'll talk about a little bit. And you can see all the locations that it's been recorded on Long Island. Now, these are mostly public lands. This certainly doesn't include all the private, vacant, or disturbed sites. But, you can see we have 53 occurrences over here, 133 over here in the west. So it's quite abundant. And if we compare that to kudzu, you see it's very isolated and limited. There are 1 to 2 occurrences in just a few spots on the island. So these might be easier to control. So what are we looking for? What is approaching the region? New introductions expected to thrive on Long Island are those that are climate compatible. So things that come from the same weather type, temperature, precipitation are expected to be here. As climate changes, we can expect species to move up the coast. And we are starting to see some of that already. Species at the extremes of climate compatibility also might start to take an isolated hold here. So if we look on a more global scale, things that are more compatible in Europe with a similar climate type will probably continue to move over here. And some species, as we heard this morning, are already making their way up the coast. Southern pine beetle, which to me is terrifying to an ecosystem. So these are some pictures that I took from EPCAL. You can see some of the galleys. And notice how funny this dead tree looks. It doesn't look like a typical dead tree that's lost all its branches and has been dead for a long time. And that's kind of a factor of how quickly it died. So again, this species can really impact the ecosystem. And then, is it truly invasive since it's native to the southeastern US? I will let you form your own opinion on that. So I'm going to go through a couple examples in different habitat types of some species that are emerging. So we have some bog bulrush, and rushes and sedges are common wetland plants. This one is native to Eurasia. Again, it's an emergent freshwater plant. It is threatening the health of wetlands throughout the US, similar to other invasives, pushes out plants. We have a couple of occurrences on Long Island, Brentwood, and in the Edgewood Oak Brush Plains. It has a really unique characteristic. You can tell that the bract is at an almost complete right angle. And the fruits don't have scales that have a notched tip, and that's kind of hard to see. You kind of need a loop to take a look at that. But this is really the key characteristic to look for on that upper bract. And there are some species that look similar, but again, they just don't have this right angle configuration. And then we have some wild chevril. Again, this is from roadsides, wet meadows, moist and open woodlands, so it does require some moisture. We have it in Shoe Swamp, Longshore Road in Cold Spring Harbor, and Alley Ponds Environmental Center. So we have these white flowers. The stems are not purple, and you have these fern-like leaves. You can kind of see they're very dissect. And the flowers have 10 plus rays. So you'd have to, again, you probably need a loop to count them all. And I don't encourage you to hurt your eyes by doing that. The bractlets are ciliate, meaning they're hairy, and you can't see that very well in any of these pictures. But they also have this long, smooth, brown fruit with a 1 millimeter beak, which you might be able to see on one of these. So these are just some things to look for, again, in a really disturbed, moist area. And you can kind of see this is wild chevril, taking over an ecosystem. You see how incredibly dense it is, and we're not seeing much else occurring in here. So things to look for. If you go to a site and see monocultures, start worrying. So floating plants in wetland habitats, water lettuce. So the originating country is unknown, but it definitely loves lakes and rivers, and it's very pretty, so it's obvious why people would start putting it in their pond tanks and eventually dump those into our lakes, rivers, ponds, streams. It has these floating pale green rosettes, long feathery roots, and green runner stems. And the fruit is a many-seeded green berry, but it's really mostly identifiable by this floating lettuce-like composition. Again, this is most likely to come from a human pathway, so likely somebody putting it in a tank and dumping it. So in open upland habitats, so our grasslands, our successional shrublands, our disturbed areas, our fallow farm fields. Here's a couple more that we should look for. So Ceteria viridis. It is a type of foxtail. Now we have very many common foxtails on Long Island, so it is a bit difficult to distinguish from our common foxtail. However, you're going to see our common foxtail always occurring with other species. Again, you're not going to see this monoculture because our common foxtail has co-evolved with everything else in its ecosystem. So once you see monocultures, again, that's when we start to worry. And it can get quite a bit larger than our common foxtails. They get up to 3 feet tall, and they can be the flowers can be very bristly. And of course, the distinctive features are in the inflorescence, so you need a loop or a macroscope to really do full positive identification. And tansy ragwort, again, something you're going to see in a disturbed area, similar to mugwort. It has these, again, very stalked basal leaves and very dissect leaf, and bright yellow flowers which have exactly 13 rays. Which is a very odd number to me, but you will definitely see these in open, disturbed areas. Italian honeysuckle. So we have a lot of honeysuckles that are already invading. Morrow's honeysuckle, Tartarian honeysuckle, Japanese honeysuckle. all with their own unique characteristics, but Italian honeysuckle can be distinguished by the fused leaves below the inflorescence, and it has yellowish and or a white reddish flower. Where some of the other honeysuckles are more yellow, our native honeysuckle is very red. This is going to be paler in color. And the upper lip of the flower, you can see right here, has 4 lobes. So that's another key distinguishing feature. So finally, woodland habitats. Hardy kiwi. I've heard that the fruit is delicious, but we certainly don't want this occurring in our woodlands. And you can kind of see the aftermath in the winter. So it has these very finely toothed leaves, and the fruits are green and grape-shaped, and they're very smooth. Of course, though, the leaf does not look like a grape. The mature bark is very gray and flaky. And again, you see large monocultures just covering things like this, you know to be a little suspicious of what's going on. Slender false brome. So we do have a couple of grasses that may look fairly similar, but this one is going to grow in the woodland understory. The majority of our natural grasses need some amount of sunlight. It has these very open leaf sheaths. So you can see it's very open right there. And it has these single spikelets that contain the fruits. And then finally, wavy leaf basket grass, which on first glance, you might confuse with deer tongue because you can see that the stem is very hairy. But in fact, it's, again, in shady forested margins and interiors. So it's one of the plants that thrives in a kind of unique environment. Both the leaf sheath and the stem are noticeably hairy, and the flowers are spikelets that alternate along the flowering stalks. You can kind of see the alternating pattern here. And just, again, here's a picture of it taking over monoculture. So how do we prepare? What do we do? How do we prevent this from becoming a problem? Because we already have enough invasive species that are impacting our ecosystems. Don't panic. As an ecologist, your first reaction probably is to panic. It certainly is mine. Because you want to return to your natural woodlands. You want to be able to walk through them. You don't want to walk through tons of multiflora rows and be abused by the plant. So really, it's kind of taking a step back, evaluating what is going on, and seeing what can be done about control. So here's just kind of a generalized invasion curve, which is showing actions appropriate at each stage. Now, prevention is always the toughest one because there's a lag phase, which I'll talk about in a minute, of from when the invasion occurs to when it's actually noticed. So emerging invasives kind of occur shortly after prevention and kind of in this early eradication phase. And this is kind of where you really want to get them before they take a hold. But again, this is kind of a graph illustrating that lag phase I was just talking about that demonstrates that by the time we recognize a species as a problem, it's already too late. And this is just a function of human nature. So again, what can we do? What do we do to be proactive to deal with this? So be vigilant. And this means really taking a look at your lands, regularly surveying them, knowing what's there, knowing what doesn't belong there. So knowledge and observations are key. Data collection is key. If you have the use of a GPS unit, correlating your data to specific locations is going to be very important. And become familiar with the species approaching the region. So there are many, many more that are potential invaders that are coming this way that I didn't go through today, but we certainly have that information available on the LISMA website, and you could just go to the website and visit the species list link. And they are sorted by species that we might see in horticultural situations and species that we would also see in natural situations. Something else that's really important is conducting research on causes and treatments for factors contributing to the successful establishment. So nitrogen and phosphorus in stormwater runoff, our pollutants and our water quality really help to feed the invasive species. Phragmites does so incredibly well on Long Island because it is thriving on that nitrogen that is running off from both our surface and groundwater. So those are some things to think about. Not planting enough natives. So, everybody loves their landscaping, but in encouraging and planting native species in their landscaping, you're actually helping protect the ecosystem and protecting our natural history. Deer overpopulation, and this can be a very controversial topic. But deer cause a significant disturbance, and when the carrying capacity of deer is exceeded, they can decimate an entire ecosystem. The deer browse opens up areas in the forest for other species to take advantage, and invasive species, by definition, are going to get there more quickly than natives can. So when you have too many deer and you're clearing all this area from their deer browse, it can definitely be an invasion pathway. And of course, dense and over-mature forests. So the flip side is true. In the age of the Anthropocene, which we're in, we have significantly modified how our forests are naturally managed. So in the Pine Barrens, where we used to have natural fires that would occur on a regular basis, because of fire suppression efforts, we don't have that anymore. And it allows for these over-mature forests that can't sustain the invasions. So forest management is incredibly helpful in maintaining and managing ecosystems. And then we need to remove pathways and vectors. So firewood is a perfect example of a vector for insect species. Emerald ash borer, Asian longhorn beetle, all have been spread through firewood and eventually start to move on their own. Nursery pots. Occasionally, how many people here have gotten a nursery pot and they get something in there that they don't want? So these are real potential problems. And ballast water. Ballast water contains a lot of our invasive species that clog up our rivers and streams. So something to be mindful of. So we can help. We can help manage your lands. LISMA is open to everybody who is interested in participating. I encourage you guys to all come down to a meeting. Our next meeting is April 16th. And we talk about all these things, how to deal with this. What can we do, and is it worth it? Are there certain sites that are too foregone? So contacting anybody who's a member of LISMA can definitely help you out. Use IMAP Invasives to collect species information. So this is such a great database that tells us where species are, and you can kind of track the new ones that are coming in and see where is their potential spread. And there is an upcoming training at Wertheim, and that is on June 7th, and that is open to everyone. I encourage you to register for it, especially if you are managing lands. And again, conducting regular surveys. Note and record new species, their relative abundance, and then decide on an action plan. Data is key, and sometimes, we get to a site before we know what to do with it, and it can become very difficult to manage. So the more data you have, the more regularly you do a survey, the better off we are. Education is something that is often talked about a lot, but I don't know if it's enforced a lot. So there are lots of resources available. Of course, the LISMA website, which I encourage everybody to take a look at and give us suggestions of things you'd like to see on there. But the Long Island Native Plants Initiative has some great information on our native ecosystems, our native ecotypes. They have local ecotype seed stock, which is great. It allows for our ecosystems to continue because they have bred seed that is historically from Long Island. So you're not getting seed from Pennsylvania to grow on Long Island. So it keeps our genetics intact. And for an easier read on the importance of natives, I'm sure many of you have heard Doug Tallamy talk. Bringing Nature Home is a great way to try to convince somebody, hand them his book and say, take a read. You know, you might change your opinion on planting this or that. I was recently working with another landscape architect who every other minute told me that he just wanted to plant white oaks because he saw Doug Tallamy's talk and said it hosted something like over 400 insects. So sometimes these easier, more personable resources are just as valuable. So I would be happy to take questions. And thank you for having me.
Okay, we have significant time for questions. If you would go to the aisle mics.
Hi, I'm from the Long Island Native Plant Initiative. I'm an intern there. And I just wanted to add that I see, Doug Tallamy's book is a huge inspiration, can be a huge inspiration, because the open space that remains that is not overtaken by natives on the North Fork or on Long Island tend to be people's home yards. I think that's the place that we have the greatest opportunity to increase natives and eliminate invasives, because we don't have the money for public land management to get rid of invasives that are already there or to even discourage them. But each individual property owner is certainly out on his lawn or in his yard all the time. So if we educate homeowners about what an invasive species is, get rid of it, as soon as they see it, which they could do, and to plant natives, we could have an incredible, thriving native plant community, and the insects and birds and everything else that it supports, by reaching the individual homeowner. And I'm at the Long Island Native Plants Initiative table. I'll be there later. Please sign up with your email address so that we can tell you when our plant sale is, and if you want to have a training about native plant use and propagation, or I forgot my last thought, but the point is that if you leave us your information, we can at least tell you. We don't send out a lot of emails. We can tell you when our plant sale is in June. Thanks.
Thank you, that's great. Yeah, I totally agree. Education is incredibly important, and there are so many people out there still that don't quite understand this problem. And, my own mother-in-law said to me, I said, oh, you should really remove that Oriental bittersweet from your backyard. Oh, but the berries are so pretty. And, it makes me cringe. So, yes, education is definitely key. Thank you.
I've got a philosophical question that I've been thinking about for about 20 years now. And the question is, excluding invasive species, I set them aside, but is there more harm in planting a non-native genotype of a native species or just a non-native species?
That's a really good question. I don't want to say that there's more harm, but in my opinion, there is a significant benefit to planting something that is of the local genotype, and here's why. The local genotype has evolved to our local microclimate. And there are conditions that are experienced on Long Island that you don't necessarily experience in Pennsylvania. So while we might have the same species, you might have switchgrass in both locations, the switchgrass from Long Island is going to thrive better because it is really adapted to our climate. So to me, the landscape scale in looking at invasions and at ecosystems is incredibly important.
That's kind of the crux of my question. Is there more harm in bringing in non-native genotypes of those native, quote-unquote, species that can mix with our native genotypes, which are adapted to local conditions? So that's what I think about.
Right. Yeah, I don't want to say that there's necessarily harm in doing that, because sometimes you just can't get seed stock. LNP is an amazing resource, and they have worked incredibly hard at getting seed stock for a variety of species. However, there are some that it's just, commercially not feasible to propagate right now. So I'd rather have something from a nearby climate that is native than have nothing at all.
Thank you.
Sure, no problem.
Has there been any effort to prevent people from selling Oriental bittersweet in supermarkets?
Yes, so actually there is both a county and a state law in place that bans the sale and transport of these species. Not every single nursery or commercial location knows about this, so again, this is where education is incredibly important. You know, getting the word out and calling out a nursery if they are selling something that they shouldn't be. I feel like Japanese barberry and miscanthus are big ones that are probably still being sold in places that shouldn't be. They're incredibly invasive, but people love them in their landscapes.
There could be wonderful T-shirts, ban bittersweet.
Yeah. We'll use it for our next fundraiser.
Hi, yes, so I just want to touch back on the prior question. So I'm also with Limpy, and I'm trained as a plant biologist. The reason that people might be wondering, well, why wouldn't you, what's the big deal? Why can't you bring something from Pennsylvania? Yeah, okay, it's not really as highly adapted, but is that such a big deal? And the reason that that can be a big deal is that you're now pulling genes from another population into this population that we hope is at least somewhat pure or, you know, localized to Long Island. So that whole gene flow, gene swamping issue comes into play. So, you know, Limpy works hard to try to provide seeds that are really highly adapted to the Long Island ecosystem. We hope that, you know, we are disseminating them out to the Long Island population and spreading those genes and maintaining that genotype so that we have that biodiversity intact on the island. That's the goal really going on there. So when you bring in stuff from Pennsylvania or someplace else, you're kind of mixing it up and it becomes more difficult to maintain that. So that's kind of just a little point I wanted to add. So as people think about where they get their plants, you know, yeah, you can't always get the local stuff. In my own yard, you know, I got a house that had all kinds of stuff in it, lilacs, I got the ivy, I got the maples, you know, I've got all that stuff. I'm doing my best to try to take it back to the local genotype. So I'm using Limpy plants, I'm taking out my lawn, and that it's not a perfect process, but we're doing the best we can. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for making the point about biodiversity. And I think it's really important to remember that part of retaining our native ecosystems and our natural history is really to maintain biodiversity. Because eventually, you know, with the loss of biodiversity, you're going to start to see the collapse of food webs, and you're going to start to see it impacting humans. You know, and these invasive species really can significantly impact those food webs. So it is important to maintain that biodiversity and maintain that local genotype to promote that type of biodiversity.
I have a wonderful picture on my phone, which I'm sorry I can't share with everybody. I took it at Lowe's, and it's a pot of a plant, and on it it is labeled invasive species harmful to the environment, and it's for sale.
That's painful. So there is a part of New York state law that not everybody is fond of. And it does allow for some species to be sold. However, they have to have that sort of notification on it so that the homeowner can make their own decision. Is it a great idea? I'm not going to comment on that, but yes, that is an unfortunate occurrence.
Let me ask a question that sort of the elephant in the back of the room. Our native genotypes are adapted to a set of conditions, climatic conditions, microclimatic conditions. What about climate change? What about what's going to happen to those genotypes? What do you think about that?
So, I mean, you hope in the long term that species will be able to evolve and adapt. You know, a lot of species have a fairly wide climate tolerance. However, you know, it is a concern. Are we going to start losing species because they just can't adapt quickly enough? And so I think the answer is we don't know. We don't know exactly what is going to happen and what's going to be able to adapt, and I think we can just do the best we can to try to keep up and keep planting natives. And if in the future that means taking natives from a more appropriate climate so they survive, I still think that's better than having something that is invasive and not evolved to our local ecosystem at all. However, again, I think it's important to point out that keeping our local genotype right now is key to preserving biodiversity.
Thank you.
Does anyone know how much acreage Harry and David puts into Riviera pears? I just wondered, because they deliver thousands of them. Where are they growing them?
That's a great question. I honestly don't know.
Okay. Lara,
All right.
thank you.
Thank you.